John Spink, Director of the Food Fraud Initiative at Michigan State University, and I'm an assistant professor in the College of Veterinary Medicine. And this is my presentation, Food Fraud Vulnerability Assessment and Prevention Strategy, at the Nordic Council of Ministers Seminar on Food Fraud, December 11th, 2018, here in Copenhagen. I'll begin. First off, the agenda for my conference here. So the first lecture today will be this Food Fraud Vulnerability Assessment and Prevention Strategy, and Lecture 2 tomorrow will be on Food Fraud Prevention Best Practices and Implementation. So I'll focus here on conducting the vulnerability assessment, and tomorrow into more detail on implementing a plan. First off, about Michigan State. So a key for us, we're educators, and we do academic research. So outreach is me being here. And then new questions come up. I go do research. I actually did research this morning, expanding on that. And then we go to publications of that in academic peer-reviewed journals. And then that links back into our education, which then comes back out into outreach. So there's a really important cycle there, and you're a big part of that. First off, our courses, the basics are MOOCs, Massive Open Online Courses. These are free content. Available online, they're on demand, basically two-hour webinars, and they build on basic food fraud concepts. Next is executive education. We do this around the world with small groups or large groups, more public meetings, and focused on specific topics. We have graduate courses. These are all online. Michigan State University food safety courses are all online. They're real Michigan State graduate courses. We have 6 that deal with food fraud in one way or another. These are education, not training. They don't teach you how to do certain things, but build the real base foundation and understanding of the topics themselves. If you take 4 of those classes, then you're eligible for a graduate certificate in food fraud prevention. So this is created as a way for people or groups to establish that they do have a real core with the concepts and fundamentals. Those credits can roll into a Master's of Science in Food Safety at Michigan State. Again, a real Master's of Science. It just happens to be online. 80% of our students are working professionals, so they're people like you that are attending here that are trying to get just more basic understanding and specific insight on the topic itself. Just real briefly before going on, I'd like to thank our Food Fraud Think Tank, its members, industry organizations, brand owners, manufacturers of Dannon, Mars, Cargill, Wegmans, Mondelez, Hershey's, and Woolworths from Australia. Really to thank them for our ability to do things like be here. And they support our mission of standardized prevention practices and to help lead policy and strategy. That's exactly what we're doing here in the development of the concepts, both to demonstrate internal and external leadership. That's within countries, within companies, and around the world. Key deliverables have been things like being able to travel to locations that don't provide travel funding, such as Codex and ISO. And if we're not able to go to Codex and ISO, we can't hear what's being discussed, and we can't contribute to the discussions as well. Also, these food fraud audit guides, these have come about from industry really asking for that kind of training themselves. A lot more information, such as this video being, or a lecture being posted on YouTube before the conference. We do reports and other types of surveys. One of our key documents or reports, deliverables, are these primer documents. So these are 2 to 4 page overviews of key topics. As you'll see on the right, food fraud implementation method. This is exactly a 1-page document that a government or a company could use. These are the 2 concepts and 7 steps we keep talking about. Also the food fraud vulnerability assessment. So all these concepts I'm talking about today are summarized in a 2-page document. They're all free on our website. And we do translate to other languages, and really it's where we have colleagues. So if you feel this is something that's valuable for you, we'd love to have you help us do the translations, and we'll list you as co-author there as well. Now there's a lot of resources, so feel free to take pictures of any slides. There's a lot of public videos of past presentations or lectures on YouTube, and here are some key ones that I'll be basically leveraging here, whether they're from Interpol, FSAI, Ireland, and others. So I think to get started, it's always important to frame the question, even though we're getting into vulnerability assessments and we've been talking about food fraud all day. Defining food fraud: intentional deception for economic gain using food. That's any deception. And the reason why we need to focus on any deception is because that's how the bad guys focus. They look for any opportunities, not just adulterant substances, not just ingredients, not just products in your country or moving across borders. They look at all products. And this broad scope is consistent with GFSI, the European Commission, UK, ISO, and others. In the US, there's a term more commonly used, or often commonly used, economically motivated adulteration, or EMA. And this is actually a subcategory of food fraud because FDA has defined it as a substance for economic gain, only a substance, not stolen goods, not tax avoidance smuggling, not counterfeits. The motivation is economic gain, but as you'll see, we'll have to go further to understand why there's an opportunity there. But something important now to talk about quickly is food defense. This is very different than food fraud because of the motivation. The motivation is very different. For food defense, the motivation is traditionally harm or terror, not economic gain for themselves. And in the U.S., the intentional adulteration rule, FDA's focus, has been narrowed to wide-scale human health harm. So that's an even smaller subcategory. There's always an economic threat. There's not always a public health threat. There is always a public health vulnerability, and that's why there's a real key focus here on looking at these vulnerabilities or system weaknesses first, because bad guys come and go and they move in and out of different industries, but the vulnerabilities of your country or your company are consistent, and those are things that you have basically under your control or more under your control, and you can reduce your vulnerability. If you locked your door of your car before you left, or the front door of your apartment, you are less vulnerable than if you left it unlocked. That has nothing to do with the people in the hallway walking around, access. If there's other burglars in the area, if there's been other break-ins, you are absolutely less vulnerable. There's a lot of examples, but we won't go into them right now. So what is food fraud? Just to clarify these different types of definitions. This is from the Global Food Safety Initiative, so this is the definition that industry is required to meet. Approximately 65% of the world trade companies are members of GFSI, and then they're implementing it across their supply chains as well. And you'll see in the upper left is really this area of adulteration or the contaminants. This is where there's going to be most of the public health threats usually, including counterfeiting. But a key is we need to align with focusing on how the bad guys look at the problem. So we look at all types of harms and all types of incidents. An example is gray market theft or diversion. If there's diversion or smuggling, then it means that there's a weakness or a lack of transparency in the supply chain. And if there's that weakness or gap, then other bad things could occur, such as counterfeiting getting in as well, a mishandled product, old expired product. Key to remember is that really, when you look at hazard analysis, it's looking at all types of root causes. So really, if you have a common food safety hazard analysis, that is really required for all types of fraud. Food risk matrix. So just real quickly, it's important to look at what is food fraud and what is not food fraud. Early on, we were working on food safety and food defense. These are pretty commonly known, but when we looked at root causes, we found that food fraud was fundamentally different because the bad guys are trying to deceive us. They're trying to actively avoid detection. Food quality is in there as well because it's an overall concept. On the left there, it's unintentional. You don't create those acts. In this column, it's intentional. The bad guys know what they're doing. And a key is that they know what they're doing, there's intent. We can then try to understand why they are making this action, why they are this intelligent adversary is a motivated offender. And the key is for yourself, you have control of looking at your vulnerabilities. So hopefully when the bad guys look around, they either don't see any vulnerabilities or they don't see vulnerabilities at the product you're required to protect. Food defense, it's public health, economic, or terror is the intent. For motivation, the goal is economic gain for themselves. And the key is they're basically a business. So we can figure out how to increase their cost and persuade them to not act. Terrorism and food terrorism is something we've talked about. And I'll bring it up briefly here because there's a lot more focus across Europe on the topic. Terrorism is really challenging as a term to deal with because you have to look at the basic definition, scope, or the legal aspects of it. What FDA did in the U.S. to avoid some of those confusing points is to focus on wide-scale harms. And that's very efficient to look at these big type of incidents. But as noted here, that doesn't cover all types of food defense, such as disgruntled employees or malicious tampering or things like that. But it's a key to just look at that as a sub-factor even within food defense. We'll focus on food fraud here. So what we see is to define why you need to do a vulnerability assessment, you need to understand what you're trying to do in the first place. So first off, we have this article that we published on implementation steps, and we have two concepts basically. One is formally define food fraud as a food issue, food safety issue. That's first and really foremost in a government to apply that. And then second is to create a government-wide, industry-wide food fraud prevention strategy. So this just makes total sense, whether you're starting new or you've been in it, such as the Danish flying squad for 12 plus years. It's really good to take a process check, to step back and look at the strategy itself. So we published this article actually with the Chinese National Center for Food Safety Risk Assessment with colleagues there, work we had done there. And we really found that we needed more details on this concept too. So we joined with Peter Whelan from Ireland, and we published this second article on looking at the role of public-private partnership. But a key is these food fraud prevention strategy steps for implementation. So basically 1 through 7 steps to get started. So again, whether you've been at this for 12 plus years or whether you're new to it, this basic concept of these 7 steps and reviewing them in a proposal is a very logical step. I mean, it's basic business practice to identify the problem, look at resources, and then make a proposal. Now, when you have a proposal, that doesn't mean you're committing to anything. You're just writing up what you think is the absolute correct, optimal way to address this. Now, when you write something up, people can look at specific parts of it, and they can review it, they can ask more questions or not. And in this case, no decision is a decision. If you have a proposal that there should be a change and people don't accept it or do it, then that's a decision to leave things with a status quo. First off, convene a food fraud task force project. This is really important that an executive at some point asks the organization for a review of this food fraud issue and a proposal for a group to look at this and consider what is the optimal role. There should be a start date and a finish date, and there should be someone responsible for it. First off, to really look at these overall enterprise-wide policy or mission statements. And if you already have mission statements, great. Put them down, document them, write them, put them in the report. And when people see these, they can start to understand whether it is covered or not covered or where it's covered and who's responsible. But that's the first step. The second is to conduct a pre-filter food fraud initial screening. A key is, when you get started, how big is the problem and what resources should be applied? If you can't explain the problem, the risk for the entire organization, the entire country, then you're kind of just begging for this. You know, to say we need to do more is not a real analytical statement, and it's not an actual proposal. So you need to start out to look very high. These initial screens, as you'll see, can be very light to start, and they're supposed to be, because you want to identify all the big problems. Then we go to find out where you don't have a lot of information or where you need to go into more detail. And this would be more of what we call a detailed vulnerability assessment. So these are the 2 steps that I'll go into later. But within the overall implementation, then next is you would plot this on a corporate risk map or a risk map to show of all the risks in your country, how they're plotted from very high to very low. And of course, you want to focus on the worst ones first and look at the worst ones where you can have the maximum impact. If you can't show a plot or a ranking of all the bad risks in your country, then you really you're just chasing incidents in responding. You're reacting. You're not being proactive or strategic. Now, in this proposal, you really should review and consider countermeasures and control systems to address the very high or high vulnerabilities. Because if you think you need to get into e-commerce, say, then you need to explain the risk and vulnerability in e-commerce and also what you would do. Because there's a lot of activities that are very efficient and some that are less efficient. But maybe you need 3 new people, or maybe you need to shift 3 people from another activity into this. You really need to have a proposal for the human resource application or controls. And then propose this food fraud prevention strategy, including the calibration with all the food risks across your enterprise. And that's the final report that can be handed off, presented, and reviewed. And usually the managers share that around, and there's other questions from other groups. But a key is you've got to write it so that we can look at it in detail and continue to polish it. So what I'll do now is get into this initial screening in more detail. So decision making, before you start to do an assessment, you have to understand what you're going to do with it. So, I mean, when you think about that, it is completely logical that you need to define the use before you start gathering information. So what we'll look at here is enterprise risk management, or what we see as a chief risk officer. You may think that this sounds like industry only, but it's not. Governments use it, and now the U.S. government is doing quite a bit with it about the last 4 years. So it's really how decision makers decide on projects. So you have a limited amount of resources within your agency, or if your agency will ask for more resources, it's still out of a finite pot of the overall government expenditures. We look at focusing on strategic risks. And for industry, that's looking at the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, that's financial reporting in the U.S. And really, this is how they communicate with financial analysts. But again, you might think that's only industry. It is not. And the U.S. government has a report, the GA Report 1763, that's good practices in managing risk. This is enterprise risk management, those same concepts applied in a government agency. So you have a citation and a reference to explain this as something that governments do. What we see is this whole idea of enterprise risk management. It's broad concepts at the top. What's great is there's already training and certifications and processes and methods and publications. We didn't make this up. This is something we just applied. And this whole chief risk officer concept is becoming more common. We need to understand and speak the language of risk. We need to do risk summaring, and we have to expand to an all hazards focus. This is all types of food fraud risks, if that's your assessment, and then these are then can be calibrated within all the risks across your enterprise. You might feel that food fraud is really bad, but it may be very low compared to some other high priority issues. So what we see with enterprise risk management is, yes, okay, a food fraud incident, it's bad, yes, but how bad? If you got a text or a tweet of one right now, would you leave the room? Would you wait till at the end of the day? Would you wait till tonight? Would you forward it to someone else? Would you wait till next week when you get back in the office? There needs to be some way to judge how bad is bad. And when you have this, then you can also defend or explain your activities. Why you did wait till the end of the day. Why you waited till the end of the month to review this. Because you'll be able to show that there are other higher priorities. Now, if someone has a problem with the amount of resources you have, or the way that you prioritized these risks, then that's fine. We can talk about it. But a key is you have some analysis to talk about. Within risk analysis, of course, there's hazard identification, and then you look at different types of decision making, and we really look at a risk tolerance or risk appetite, because you don't really address every single risk. I mean, it is the food industry. It is food. We want to shift from probability to likelihood. That's looking at ISO 31000 risk management, and it shifts from a more analytical or statistical approach to more qualitative, which is fine to start, and from severity to consequence. And this is something also that's a shift from ISO 31000. If you use these broad ISO terms, then you'll be consistent with the rest of the world, really, and can share best practices. And that's the reference for ISO. So right here is what we've got is how bad is bad. Sometimes we see the issues are right there in the middle of the B. So at least if you got that information of an incident, then you would be able to start, in your mind anyway, to start to think, is it A, B, or C? And if it is in the C zone, you know you can wait till the end of the day, and maybe next week. If it's in the B zone, it's something you really should start to look at. If it's in the A, then you absolutely know you need to leave the room right now and go deal with it. And that's the real key of having this to explain. So now that we understand what we're trying to do with the, say, incidents or information or vulnerabilities, now we have framed the question and we can look at what is a vulnerability assessment. So we see as a hierarchy here. And overall, there's enterprise risk management that's based on the overall corporate risk appetite or the company risk appetite. And you've got the two stages here of the assessments, vulnerability assessments. One is this pre-filter and one is the detail. And there's different resources for that. If you all of a sudden are going to more detail, then there are other even more detailed assessments you can use. And everything then fits back into a cycle here. But the key that we'll look at right here is the green box, which is the pre-filter. Now, this is something that there's actually a method, and you can have a citation from Food Control Journal, and this is something we published in 2017. And really to look at, it's defining that food fraud is illegal, the laws are under development, and really there needed to be this type of pre-filter along here, and it is consistent and aligned with enterprise risk management principles. It also correlates with food safety and food fraud management systems. The way that we start out is we look at incoming goods and outgoing goods. Buying product from India is very different from selling product to India. So we really found that we couldn't get any more detailed that in the assessments. Then break it up into product groups. We recommend 5 to start, just because every time you add more, the assessment gets more complex. You can always do more assessments later. So we look at broad product groups. We also look at supply or customers. Now you could look generally at product coming from countries, but really we see more the supply chain is more about product coming from companies. And if you could say so brokered product from a country maybe, but say you're buying from a major Swedish company, then you're judging their supply chain, not just that it's coming from Sweden itself. So you start with economic and then later consider the health hazards as well. But it's really easier to start out thinking of the economic impacts overall. So this is just what it looks like, real simple matrix. And you start to think about and brainstorm, where does the product come from and what type of products come in as well. So you'll see here we said spices from, say, North America, and that happened to be a very high for this type of assessment. Now, when you fill out that form, so remember, look back at that form, A1 is a cell there with very high. Then we would look in here to define cell A1, and then you'd explain a very high, because any adulterant in a meat product has a very high likelihood to cause illness, and we just put a lot of details there. I can't remember what I did yesterday, let alone what I put in an assessment a couple weeks ago, so documentation is very key. And this is very light to start. The key is you've got a starting point. The goal, the end goal, is to have this type of risk map. And this is an actual assessment from a company. And we thought that they were going to be really bad from a food fraud perspective. But it ends up that they were not so bad. They had 4 there in the orange zone. But this is a real key. Now you have something to talk about, to explain the food fraud vulnerabilities and what you're working on. And all of a sudden there would be this key is looking at the questions of 1, 2, A, and B. So right here on the same one single sheet, why not? Just put 1, 2, A, B, and then we added D there as well. But it was some kind of detail to explain what those are. And at that point, you can start to explain what you're doing and why you're doing it. Does a resource allocation decision maker need more information? For what question? A key is at this point, you've looked at all the assessments across your company or country, and now you can talk about those key actions at the top. Now you can talk about whether you have the resources to deal with them and to really have a discussion about how bad are these, and is it something that really needs to be prioritized? And a key is that you're starting a discussion. You're a really competent starting point. So we look at when we do these assessments. So say we did that one for your whole country with a very high level. Maybe dairy is 1, meat is 1. But we look at this and we dig down deeper, only as deep as you need to go. So don't assess every single product everywhere to start. Do this broad assessment and identify where there's a problem. So let's say, for the sake of simplicity and argument, that this was the incoming goods assessment for your whole country. So red, orange, yellow, green, blue. So the 2 red ones are the bad ones. So let's say with that cell B2. So with that one, let's dig into more detail. So at this point, we do another one of those 5x5 matrix of just that one. And of course, I'm being simplistic here, but let's say that there was only one of the detail in there in cell D3 that caused cell B2 above to be an actual high or very high risk. So since there's that one, then it would be logical to dig into that one. And of course, I'm being simplistic, but let's say within that one cell, there's one product. So this might be, at the beginning might be fruit from North America. The second might be frozen fruit from different states in America. And the bottom one might be sweet tart cherries frozen from Michigan. And that might be then specifically down there to say from Spink, that you bought it from me. So it's buying from one supplier. Now, you want to drill down until it supports one risk treatment to resolve that. So you might say stop buying tart cherries from Spink. That's a very specific countermeasure. Now we can assess the vulnerability. If you stop buying from me, if I'm the only one that's causing the bad product, you stop buying from me, then that cell all of a sudden goes from red to green because you're not buying from me, as long as you make sure I can't sneak it back in the system. But all of a sudden that goes to red. Now let's go back up one level. It changed. It's looked at D3, now changed over there. I guess I said D2, so it should be D3. But that changed to a green and then back up. All of a sudden now the very high level, country level assessment for all fruit imported from North America is now a green. It went from a red from a green because you had a detail for one risk treatment that can change the rank. And now you've got that cell B2 is acceptable. So that's a key, is starting very high and then drilling down and then coming back up. And a key here is you have a method. You've tried to do things. And if someone else comes back and corrects your method, then, well, so be it. That's fine. So people have told me that you can't do this for a country level. Well, okay, let's talk about that. And I had a challenge at a conference to do that. So here's an example of a country level vulnerability assessment. So we looked at CountryB, let's say. It's a European country. And I will say that the assessment is very low certainty and low robustness because the risk treatment group was me, alone, in my hotel room. But here's what this plot looked like. So if you see this overall assessment, then you look up here that there's a number of them are up here in the red zone. E would be the one to look at first, look in great detail. And then these other ones, B, F, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, would be the ones to look at a little bit further. Now these other ones are a concern, of course, but they're much lower. And this is what a summary would look like. So E was the bad one. Export product, meat, seafood, dairy. So this must be product that they were concerned about leaving the country that have a problem, and that could also be a very high impact because it could affect all the economic value of exports from that country, especially for seafood or for food. So the next one was looking at online and e-commerce. And so we're looking at selling or advertising food online. Now a key is that we've got to define the scope. What is e-commerce? Is that a local grocery store that delivers product home that you happen to order online, or is it only from websites outside the country? Whatever the definition is fine, but at least you're writing the definition down. But here we've got this whole food fraud, economic or illegal deception for economic gain using food from online and ordering is what we said. And we looked at the methods of selling by means of distance. So we started to define what is e-commerce. We looked at websites, social media pages, online marketplaces, mail order, and then this whole telephone, text message, catalogs, newspapers. So what is the e-commerce market? We dug in here to say food, ingredients, finished products, alcohol. Now, for the sake of this example, I needed to go into detail. So we picked alcohol, we picked vodka. And then when we looked at how the vodka is sold in general, we looked at the major retailers and specialty retailers, minor retailers, bazaars, kiosks, flea markets, white van individuals. This is someone driving around selling the extra inventory. And online. So overall, for the country, online was one way that the product was into the marketplace. So that is the e-commerce part of vodka in a country. Then we could go into the online e-commerce type sales and look at where the product came from, because we're trying to dig in to see where we're going to go look and investigate. Local inventory, major websites, minor spam websites, peer-to-peer, or other. So we were looking at what's the market, what's e-commerce. So this whole idea of what is delivery, we looked at that local delivery, that was direct delivery, so that could be from, say, a retail store. Courier delivery, where that retailer hands it to someone else to be delivered. Domestic mail, international shipments, and then P2P handoff or other. This is person to person. So it might be that someone gets a WhatsApp offer to buy vodka at 2 a.m. in downtown Dublin, and they respond to that. And that's something that has been an issue and a concern. Common sense? Well, did you do the overall review? Is it written? Can you prove you did it? That's something to say with all this assessment is why are you doing what you're doing, and could you show me that? Now, it's one thing if you wrote it on a piece of paper or just thought about it over coffee, but you need to be able to prove it really for process improvement. Can you refine the process or assessment? And that's another thing about writing it is you can do process improvement. What we see here is this really basic set of food fraud vulnerabilities or really final documents that you need. And one is this rank to be able to show the summary of your vulnerability assessment, and another is the prevention method. Now, I think also there's two more that are just good to have a review of the overall policy or laws related to this topic, and then previous results or inspections. With that, I'll say thank you. There's a lot of ways to interact with us, a lot of people to thank, including the organizers and others here. And with that, I'll take questions.